Welcome to Human Footprints. Cleopatra VII Thea Philopator is the queen who dared Rome to blink. And at Actium, on the 2nd of September 31 BCE, her gamble turns into a moment nobody can unsee. Antony's fleet bogs down in smoke and ore splash, and then Cleopatra's 60 ships catch the wind and break for open water, leaving everyone watching to decide if it's strategy, betrayal, or the instant Egypt starts to slip away. In Rome, Octavian scrubs the messiness out of a civil war and sells a cleaner story. Not Romans versus Romans, but Rome versus the Queen. Senators repeat it. Coins and slogans reinforce it. And Cleopatra gets flattened from a ruler with policies and fears into a single foreign threat that makes conquest feel like self-defense. In Alexandria, in 48 BCE, Cleopatra forces Rome to meet her on her terms. Smuggled into Julius Caesar's quarters. Later described as hidden in bedding or a sack. Because her brother's faction has pushed her out. She steps into lamplight and argues for her throne with a calm that feels like performance. But the stakes are brutal. Without Caesar, she's a displaced teenager with an army at the gates and nowhere left to retreat. In 34 BCE, at the donations of Alexandria, Cleopatra sits on a gilded dais as titles are proclaimed over her children like political spells, daring Rome to accept a new Eastern order. Then, in 30 BCE, Octavian's standards press toward Alexandria and Cleopatra. 39, painfully alone at the top, has to choose between being paraded in a Roman triumph or taking the last thing still hers, control of the ending. But how did it all begin? Before we dive into the story, if you're enjoying this documentary, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment below. Alexandria looks invincible. Ships jam the great harbor under the Pharos, and Greek officials in white linen move money and paperwork like it's oxygen. But outside the palaces, Egyptian priests and dockworkers live under different rules, and Cleopatra grows up watching her kingdom split along language lines. Who gets heard? Who gets fed? Who gets ignored? The lesson lands early and hard. Power isn't only armies. It's who controls the words that count. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII Auletes, doesn't rule like a god-king. He bargains like a debtor, and Rome is the lender. In 59 BCE, he buys recognition through Roman politics and cash, and by 55 BCE, he's back on the throne because Aulus Gabinius marches a Roman army into Egypt and reinstates him. Cleopatra watches the lesson burn in. Egypt's crown can be purchased, and the bill comes due in obedience. Inside the court, Cleopatra trains for survival the only way a young princess can. She learns to speak so people have to listen. Greek is the language of the dynasty, but she reaches for Egyptian too. Something later writers single out. So priests and petitioners hear her directly, not through courtiers who might be selling her out. In a palace where siblings can become enemies overnight, every sentence is a weapon she can hide in plain sight. In 51 BCE, Ptolemy XII dies, and Cleopatra, about 18, steps into the throne room and finds her rule already boxed in. She must co-reign with her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy XIII, while the men around him hold the knives. Low Nile floods bring grain anxiety and angry crowds. And inside the palace every decree becomes a fight over whether her name stands first or gets pushed aside. Under that pressure, audacity stops being a personality trait and becomes a survival instinct. Her co-rule doesn't collapse with a battle. It collapses with paperwork. Around 49 BCE, Cleopatra's name stops appearing on official documents, and coinage shifts to Ptolemy XIII alone, like she's already been written out. Pothinus the eunuch, Achilles the general, and Theodotus of Chios turn the palace into a machine that grinds her authority down to dust. For Cleopatra, it's a physical kind of panic. If the state stops saying her name, Egypt starts forgetting she ever had the right to rule. Forced out of Alexandria, Cleopatra reaches the eastern frontier near Pelusium and then into Syria, and survival turns unglamorous fast. Hard coin, promises, mercenaries, and a moving court held together by nerve. No marble halls. Just tents, ledgers, and the sound of armor being fitted for men who might walk away tomorrow. Pride doesn't feed an army, so every decision becomes a test of the one tool she can always carry: her words. Egypt tries to keep Rome's civil war at arm's length, and it backfires. Pompey the Great lands near Pelusium in 48 BCE, and Ptolemy XIII's advisors murder him instead of offering refuge. Julius Caesar arrives right after, furious. Not out of love for Pompey, but because Egypt has hijacked Rome's victory narrative and handed him a severed head like it settles accounts. Alexandria turns into a pressure cooker, and Cleopatra's family feud is suddenly trapped inside Caesar's conquest. Cleopatra understands the trap immediately. Meet Caesar publicly, and her brother's faction can block her. Stay invisible, and she stays erased. So she forces a private audience, smuggled into the palace, remembered as a carpet or a linen sack, and steps out with no army behind her, only her voice. In that room, she has to make herself feel like Egypt's solution, not Egypt's problem, because survival depends on being seen on her terms. Caesar's victory in Alexandria keeps Cleopatra on the throne, but the real shockwave lands in 47 BCE. She gives birth to Ptolemy XV and brands him with the most provocative name possible: Caesarion. In a court trained to erase people with paperwork, a baby becomes ink you can't scrape off. Every time Roman envoys look a beat too long at the child, the danger tightens in her chest. Cleopatra answers danger by tightening her grip on symbols. Her face goes out on coinage, and in temples, she leans into Egyptian divine kingship, tying herself to Isis so the country sees a sacred queen, not Rome's client. It's statecraft with a pulse. Greek court titles for the elites, pharaonic imagery for the priests, and one message underneath: Egypt has a ruler, and Rome doesn't get to name her. In 46 BCE, Caesar brings Cleopatra to Rome and keeps her close as a foreign monarch in his orbit, and the city reacts like it's been insulted in its own living room. Senators stare, gossip hardens into hatred, and her presence becomes a weapon aimed at Caesar. Cleopatra holds her posture anyway. Every banquet feels like a knife edge, protecting Caesarion's claim while sensing Rome rehearsing the story it wants to tell about her. On the 15th of March 44 BCE, Caesar is stabbed in the Senate house, and Cleopatra's protection vanishes in one violent afternoon. No treaty clause can replace a living patron. She gets out of Rome and back to Egypt, then tightens the dynasty like a fist. Ptolemy XIV fades from the record, and Caesarion is pushed forward as co-ruler, because in a world that erases names, she needs her sons to survive. Meanwhile, Rome doesn't settle. Power concentrates into Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus, and Egypt starts to feel like a prize again. In 41 BCE, Antony summons Cleopatra to Tarsus like he's calling a client to court, and she refuses the setting by bringing her own. A gilded barge on the Cydnus, purple sails, musicians, perfume thick enough to claim the whole quay. Spectacle as a boundary line. Antony doesn't just meet a queen. He meets a story that won't sit still, and he wants to be inside it. Antony follows her back to Alexandria and reaches into the one wound that never really closes. Her sister Arsinoe IV, still alive as a sanctuary suppliant at the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus. In 41 BCE, Arsinoe is killed on Antony's order, right at the edge of sacred ground. Cleopatra gets what survival has demanded from her since childhood: silence, and no rival left to carry a different version of the dynasty. The alliance stops being romance and turns into infrastructure. Cleopatra bankrolls Antony's power in the east: cash, grain, ships. And he gives her what Caesar's death stole: a Roman shield that moves with an army. In 40 BCE she gives birth to twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and presents them like policy: children as borders, motherhood as a way to make tomorrow feel claimed. When Antony returns in 37 BCE, the reunion isn't private. It's negotiation with intimacy at the center. By 34 BCE, Antony stages the donations of Alexandria like a rival capital's coronation, handing out kingdoms as titles. Armenia, Syria, Libya. Spoken into existence. Cleopatra is proclaimed Queen of Kings, and Caesarion is elevated as King of Kings, turning ceremony into a challenge Rome can't politely ignore. It also gives Octavian the image he needs. An Egyptian queen crowning a Roman's rival heir, ready-made to be called betrayal. In 32 BCE, Octavian makes the fight feel clean by aiming it at Cleopatra, not Antony. War is declared against Egypt's queen, and a Roman civil war puts on the mask of foreign invasion. Antony's will, kept with the Vestal virgins, gets dragged into the light and used like a blade. Burial in Alexandria. Cleopatra named in the same breath as Roman politics, and the room can feel the story snapping shut around her. Everything she's used as power, spectacle, symbols, even intimacy, gets flipped into an accusation that she's a spell corrupting a Roman man. On the 2nd of September 31 BCE, at Actium off western Greece, Cleopatra's and Antony's fleet is trapped by Octavian's blockade while Agrippa's ships squeeze the exits, and the fight turns into heat, smoke, and splintering oars. Cleopatra keeps her 60 Egyptian ships together behind the line with sails ready. Treasure aboard, a straight shot planned for open water. Because if Egypt loses the fleet, the future she built for her children goes with it. When her squadron breaks through a gap, the sea reads it as panic or betrayal, and the worst part is that Antony follows her, turning a strategy into a public collapse. Actium doesn't end with a treaty. It ends with silence. Allied kings peel away, commanders defect, and Cleopatra's letters stop pulling results the way they used to. Back in Alexandria, she plans for two endings at once: testing poisons on condemned prisoners, and sealing a stone mausoleum near the temple of Isis with her treasure inside, as if death itself can be bargained with. It's the same old lesson from her youth, only now the walls closing in are Roman. In 30 BCE, Octavian's forces push into Egypt, and when a false report spreads that Cleopatra is dead, Antony breaks. He tries to kill himself, but the wound doesn't finish the job. Cleopatra has him hauled to her sealed monument and pulled up through a high window by ropes, bleeding and barely conscious, the strongest man in the East reduced to dead weight in her hands. When he dies there with her, it isn't just love collapsing. It's her last Roman shield disappearing, leaving her alone with Octavian's version of her life. Octavian enters Alexandria in 30 BCE and turns Egypt into a possession, not a partner. Cleopatra's treasury, her docks, her grain, all of it redirected into a new Roman order. He wants her alive for a triumph, because nothing sells Rome saved itself like a foreign queen in chains. Even without her, he still gets what he came for: the conquest, and the story, coldly sealed into the record. Octavian can't leave a living symbol behind, and Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, about 17, carries the one name that threatens him. Caesar. Ancient sources say the boy is lured back toward Egypt with promises, then intercepted and executed, because a rival claim doesn't need an army, it just needs a face on a coin. It's the ugliest end to Cleopatra's motherhood as policy. Everything she built for continuity cut down to prevent a future challenge. The other children aren't erased the same way. Cleopatra Selene and Alexander Helios, and little Ptolemy Philadelphus, are taken to Rome and marched in Octavian's triumph, then raised in Octavia's household. The same Octavia Antony, humiliated, now made caretaker by the victor. Selene is the one history still lets us follow, married to Juba II and sent to rule Mauritania from Caesarea, where her coins later carry her name and titles, a small, stubborn echo of what her mother fought to keep alive. Augustus rebuilds the world with Egypt's money and grain, and he floods Rome with moral messaging that turns Cleopatra into a cautionary tale. The foreign seductress, the queen who enslaved a Roman man, the excuse that makes conquest look like virtue. After that, The reinventions multiply. Horace and Propertius, Plutarch a century later, Shakespeare, Hollywood. Each version reflecting its own fears more than her reality. Strip the propaganda down to languages, policies, ships, heirs, and that final refusal to be paraded, and Cleopatra stops being a fantasy and becomes what she always was, a ruler fighting for a country, and fighting just as hard over what her name is allowed to mean.